Hello everybody, 6-Speed Dakota here, and today I don't really have a project in the garage. It's kind of getting busy, it's kind of midterm time, but I do have a bunch of videos lined up for you guys, so don't worry about that. I've been getting a lot of flak comments lately from my Hyundai Santa Fe oil change because I said if you put 10W30 in a 5W20 motor, you're going to blow it up. Well, in all truth and fairness, I used to be a technician. I was an oil change guy at Honda, and I have seen several times, not necessarily at Honda, but I've seen in different places the result of somebody using the wrong type of oil. So we're just going to go over what the different kinds of oil and that kind of thing and what they mean. So basically I'm going to use my hood. There's my baby in the garage. It's my birthday today, so my cell phone may go off a couple of times while we're doing this. So we're going to use my good old engineer sketch pad. So we're going to say that we're going to draw this guy here. I'm not very good at drawing, so bear with me. That is the crankshaft. Okay. And this guy here is the main bearings. So inside the main bearings there's a little passage where oil gets pumped in here. Oil. So the way oil works is this crankshaft spins at a very high velocity. So in order to keep the crankshaft bearings from wearing out, so there'd be these little bearings in here. Now these are called plain bearings because they have no moving parts. Now this bearing is under what they call a hydrodynamic lubrication, which means it always has lubricant to help the crankshaft ride on the bearing. So the crankshaft doesn't actually ride on the bearing. So oil, so let's say this is oil, at a molecular level just looks like little ball bearings like this. They're perfectly round. Now, water, on the other hand, has oblong molecules like this. Now, they can be in whatever form, but frozen water or solid ice, all the water molecules line up in a row like this and effectively become larger. That's the tendency of water to expand when frozen. So oil's like little ball bearings. So let's say, just relatively, that this is a 5W20 and this would be a 10W30 and this would be, let's say, a 20W50. 50. So you can see the relative size between 5W20, 1030, and 20W50. So the molecules are effectively larger. So this little area here is actually filled with these little oil molecules. Oops. So this is oil right here. And that effectively allows the crankshaft to ride without riding on the bearing. Now, what ends up happening is the oil molecules, they'll start to break down and they'll basically just become flat. So it's like these are like little bubbles and they just pop over time. That's why we change the oil. So the oil becomes runnier to a point when the engine oil needs to be changed, but then all of a sudden all these molecules will start to clump together and become big globby like that, and that's why if you never ever change your oil in a long time, they become thick sludge. So they all kind of blend together, and yeah, not good. So this sludge can actually clog up these oil passages. Now, the crank to main bearing and the rod bearing to crankshaft bearings actually are the most common ones to seize. It's not the piston on the cylinder wall. That's why it's crucial to maintain the size in here. So say I was to use, say this is a 10W30 and I put a 20W50 in there, well, those oil molecules are going to have to be squeezed in there. So it's going to have to, the oil pump, which sucks the oil, so let's say this is the oil pan, and the pump, which has a little sump here, and then you get the little pump, the two little gears, and it feeds the oil up this way. So that pump, if this is 5W30, which is what's designed for my Dakota here, the big shiny yellow Dakota, it's gonna have to suck the oil up here, and then it's gonna have to push it up all the way up into the oil galleys. Now, using a thicker engine oil, this pump is going to have to work harder to push it up there. Now this pump, in this line that goes up here, you're going to have a pressure relief valve. Like that. So when the pressure gets too great, it opens that relief valve. Because oil, or any kind of fluid, the molecules are so close together it's virtually incompressible. So if you don't have this relief valve, you can end up rupturing oil lines and bad stuff like that. So essentially, if I put too thick of oil in here, the engine will be forcing that oil in there. It'll be working so much harder that this will actually starve it of oil, because these oil passages are too thin, too small for such a thick oil. Now, as the crank bearings start to wear out a bit, then this clearance in here becomes larger. So say your motor's starting to wear out and knock a bit, that's when you want to put a little bit thicker oil in it to try to prolong the life. But as the engine sits right now, fairly new, do not mess with your grade of oil. Okay? That's the little theory here. So, because what this will actually do, so say we'll draw out a rod bearing here. So let's say this is the crank, oops, and this is the connecting rod. It's hard to look through the viewfinder of the camera to do this. And then there's the bearing in here. So essentially, here's your little oil molecules here. Now, how the crank is fed is there's actually a hole in the crankshaft from the main bearing. So there's a little hole inside here, like this, and then the center of the crank main bearing is actually drilled out, and that supplies oil up the crankshaft, and the centrifugal force of the crankshaft rotating around will actually sling the oil out of the crank. So there's this little passage in here, from there into the rods. So oil's going to have an even harder time, forget getting from the main bearings, it's going to have an even harder time getting to the rod bearings. This is the rod, my lousy drawing of a rod. Now what this could actually do, so if here's the rod and here's the crank and here's the bearings, if there is nothing here to lubricate this, what the crank will actually do is it'll actually grab on to the rod bearing, because there's nothing for this thing to ride on. So it clashes, the rod will clash up against the bearing, grab the bearing, and actually force the bearing to spin inside there. And that's where you get that very loud tap, 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 tap noise when you've spun a rod bearing. Nobody wants to spin a rod bearing. It's very, very expensive to fix, because you basically have to replace both the rod, the crankshaft, and probably the whole bottom end of the motor by the end of the endeavor. So I'm going to point out the different kinds of oil which I got here on the ground. Now this is a milk jug full of used motor oil. Fairly simple. I believe this is 5W20. A lot of the oil I change is 5W20. This is 10W30. And you can hear, just by the sound of it, that it's a little bit thicker than this stuff. This is more of a, this is a little bit lighter consistency than this. And you can just tell as well. This here is a 25W40. This is actually mercury oil for my bayliner. And this stuff is really thick compared to that. This is a two-stroke oil. And this stuff's actually really thin, but I'll explain the two-stroke oil last. This here is a type of gear lube. It's actually Mercury Gear Lube Plus for the Bayliner. And this stuff's really thick as well. This is 75W90 synthetic gear oil. This stuff's actually a lot thinner than that. But I'm going to talk about weights in a second. And this is 10W40. It's about the same weight as 10W30, and I'll explain the different weights. And this is the last kind of oil, basically. We got a non-detergent, just standard 20W. Unfortunately, I don't have any SAE 30 or anything like that, but the W here stands for winter. It doesn't stand for weight. So an SAE 20 is going to be a lot thicker at sub-zero or sub-freezing temperatures than an SAE 20W. That W has anti-viscosity additives to prevent it from thickening up. So, same kind of thing. As oil gets cold, it gets really, really thick, and it doesn't flow so well. So, what is the term viscosity? Well, viscosity refers to the oil's resistance to flow. So, the numbers 5W20 is a relative viscosity based on different engine oils. The numbers don't really mean anything. There's two kinds of viscosity. That's kinematic and dynamic viscosity, but that's more of a fluid dynamic term. And since I'm in engineering, I'm not going to go through a year's worth of explanation about different kinds of viscosity. So a 5-weight viscosity is going to be a lot thinner relative to a 20-weight viscosity. Now, motor oils have their own category. So a gear oil 70 weight is not going to be the same as a motor oil 70 weight. They have their own classifications. So a 70 weight, I'm not 100% sure. I think it's about a 25-30 weight. Maybe even more. I don't know. I'm not 100% certain. But it doesn't mean that it's like a 70 weight motor oil. That they have a different classification rating altogether. So, back to the motor oils. So obviously, a 10W40 is going to be thicker than, a 10W40, a 10W30 is going to be thinner than a 25W40. Now what the 25 means is it's approximately 25 weight when it's cold and a 40 weight when it's warm, up to a certain point, because these have what they call viscosity additives. Now, some of these additives allow for the oil to stay thin at cooler temperatures to a certain point. Once it starts getting really cold, then it gets really thick. So, average temperatures. In extreme cases, yes, it will get thick or thin at high temperatures. But once it starts warming up to operating temperature, the oil will thicken because these other additives will they're actually really sticky and they join all the molecules together to make a thicker oil to resist it when it thins out when it gets warm, which inevitably happens. Oil is very, very, very sensitive to heat. If you heat it up, it will get thin. That's just the way that they are. Any kind of lubricating oil. So, what we'll do is we'll put a drop of each one of these on a piece of cardboard here. Now this stuff is non-detergent compressor oil. This is motor and compressor oil. But what a non-detergent oil means is it doesn't have any additives. There's no star on it that says for gasoline engines like any of these have. Okay? Now on the back, you're going to have an API classification. Now this one says API service SM. Now all oils are energy conserving nowadays. I can't think of any off the top of my head that aren't. Now what the SM means is that there's SA through SM now, and it'll keep going on as time goes further and they develop new additives. But SA has no additives, so this would be an SA grade oil because it has no additives. SM has a lot of additives in it. So anti-viscosity, anti-foaming, that kind of thing. Because as the crankshaft spins inside the engine, it whips the oil around. So if your oil gets foamy, the oil pump will cavitate and it won't pump the oil properly. So let's start with the thinnest stuff. This is actually an air compressor oil because obviously an air compressor doesn't burn any fuel and doesn't get contaminated. That's the other reason we changed the oil, is because you see how black that is. That's because carbon blows past the cylinder rings. Like, there's no such thing as a perfect seal, especially with a cast iron piston ring. The ring gap cannot touch, because if it does, it will expand even more and it'll have no place to go. So it'll dig into the cylinder wall, but it can also cut the top of the piston off, basically. So we don't want that. So there's always going to be a little bit of combustion gas seeping in there. And that's where we get that dark oil from. Now, synthetic oil actually doesn't break down as much. You know, in extreme cases it will break down, but it doesn't break down like a conventional oil. This is a conventional oil. This is a synthetic oil. And once again, it will not break down like a conventional oil. However, once again, it does get contaminated. That's why we change it, but you don't have to change it as often per se. So I'm just going to put a little dot of this right here. There we go. Now you see it's very, very light. It's not amber really at all. It's actually almost totally clear. And this is actually a mineral-based oil. I put a little bit more than I had wanted to on there. So it means it comes out of the ground. It's old dinosaurs, basically, is what it is. And this cardboard will be soaking up this oil, I see right now. Okay, so this is a fairly thin oil. Now if it was SAE 20, it would probably be a lot thicker because it doesn't have those winter additives in it. So now for our 10W30, oops, I'm going to put this down for just a second, get the cap off. Now you see as I pour it, or attempt to pour it, there we go. You can actually see the little bubblies in there, that kind of thing, because that is some of the additives and stuff like that. Now you see, if I tilt it, it will want to run quite readily, but not near as much as say a 5W20 or a 5W30. Wipe that guy off. But this stuff is actually a lot darker, if you can see inside there. It's quite a bit darker than that kind of oil because of all the additives and stuff like that. Now, this is royal purple, and it obviously comes purple. I believe it's just a purple dye. I'm not 100% sure. Somebody will probably correct me on this. I don't want to use too much of this stuff because it's quite expensive. There we go. You see how dark that is. Well, this is twofold. You see on my finger it is quite purple. This is actually a motorcycle and ATV motor oil. And because ATVs and motorcycles have the transmission contained on the side of the engine, or inside the engine oil also has to lubricate the transmission, which has to have special additives for the clutch inside there. So that's why that's much, much darker. So we're going to do... Actually, I should open this bottle next. Now you can see how, once again, how easily this stuff drips off my finger like that. Now, I'm going to take this real... Oh, it's not even open. Look at that. This stuff is actually really expensive because it's from Merck. If I stick my finger in there, this stuff's taking a lot longer to drip off my finger. You see right there. This oil's much, much thicker and stickier than this oil here. You can see how quickly this stuff runs off my finger like that. So this is a heavier weight motor oil, and because it's so thick, even if I pour a little bit, you can see it takes a lot longer to pour. So that is a thicker engine oil. Now we'll move on to the gear oils. So this is Gear Lube Plus, and this is also quite thick. Same kind of thing. You're going to see it's going to take a little bit more to pour. And you see how thick that stuff is. Look at the nice long strings it's making, because that oil is very, very thick. The thicker the oil is, technically the stickier it is as well, which makes gear oils better for lubricating that kind of way. Fortunately, I don't have any automatic transmission fluid on me right now. Okay. Okay, this is some 7590 synthetic, which doesn't have the cap cut on it, unfortunately. So this stuff's going to be a lot thinner. Oh, and it smells too. Synthetic oil, see how much thinner that is. This is 75 weight oil, and see how thin that is? See how easily I can brush it around versus this stuff? This stuff's a lot thicker, a lot tackier. See how the cardboard lifts right off the ground? Hardly with this stuff. So that's the difference in thickness of oil. And you can kind of see my point, what I'm getting at. Now, this last one here is actually a two-stroke oil. Gotta get the top off. There we go. Now, this stuff is completely different. This stuff's really thin. In fact, it's pretty much like water. You see how easily this stuff splashes if I tap it. If I tap gear oil here, nothing happens. Well, this oil is actually designed to mix with gasoline and mix completely to form a homogeneous mixture. So it means that this stuff doesn't come out of suspension. It doesn't all just float right to the top of the mix. That's another lesson for another day. Now this is the used motor oil. Stuff I do for you guys. You see how dark this stuff is. If you could smell it, you'd understand too. Notice how thin this is. This doesn't tack at all. Yet this oil here, which is a 10W40, tacks really well. It sticks to my finger. This stuff, not really. So if I put a drop of motor oil on the concrete and a drop of used motor oil on the concrete, then I take my shop rag and I wipe them both. Look here, see that nice sheen on the ground? Versus this one here, I wipe them both. That sheen left over is actually from the new motor oil. This stuff doesn't create that film, because oil is actually very sticky, but once it starts to break down, it doesn't stick as well. So that's my little explanation on motor oil. So if you had a really thick oil like this, you can't even hear it sloshing around in there. It's so thick. Now if I have a thinner motor oil like this, you can actually hear it because it flows that much better. So if you put a thick motor oil in your engine, got my rag here, then your oil pump is going to have to work hard to pump it up into the bearings and up to the top end of the motor. Now my Dakota here, this actually has an overhead cam engine, and it has to pump all the oil up to the top of the motor to lubricate the camshafts. Then that's very, very important to use the correct weight oil, because if you use too thick of an oil, it's going to starve your camshaft and burn them up. So that's very, very important with any kind of overhead cam motor, any kind of Honda, Toyota, my Dakota, the Ford modular engines, that kind of thing. It's very, very important that you use the correct grade and weight of motor oil, or else you're going to end up with some problems in the top end. These motors already have a problem with sludging and starving the top end of the motor if you don't change your oil often enough. So be sure to change your oil and use the correct weight. Now it goes the other way as well. If you use too thin of an oil, then all the oil is just going to leak out of here and back into the oil pan very easily because it's very, very runny. And you're not going to get the protection that you need. So use the correct weight of motor oil. Now, back in the day when cars first came out, they didn't have all the digital technology like we do today. So, meaning that all the machining was done on lathes and by hand and that kind of thing. And all the polishing, all done. There's no digital instrumentation, nothing. So, the tolerances are much, much looser then than they were today. Alright, pardon the rude interruption, or not so rude I guess. So before, back when they first started doing engine oil and that kind of thing, it had to be thicker to maintain the oil pressure in those looser tolerances. So thicker oil, obviously you saw how sticky it was, it drags more. So that dragging, basically, not that energy conserving label means that it allows the parts to slide easier, essentially, which uses less power and gets you better fuel economy. If the engine doesn't have to work as hard, it's going to get you better gas mileage. So with the tighter tolerances today, they can use a thinner oil, which still lubricates very well, and it also doesn't cause the drag on the parts. That's why older engines use thicker oil. And same thing with the transmissions. You don't put gear oil in a transmission now unless you want to blow it up, because that is way too thick. 90% of transmissions, manual transmissions, will use automatic transmission fluid, which is about a 20 weight motor oil versus a thicker 50, 60 weight relatively with your heavyweight gear oils. So same situation. Machining tolerances were looser. You had to use a thicker engine oil in order to maintain that oil film. So I'm going to go because I got to take a friend's truck into emissions testing today, unfortunately. But that's not a big deal. Alright, thank you for watching. I hope this clears up the air. Please don't leave any nasty comments. I'm kind of getting sick of dealing with them. But if you have any other requests on stuff you need to do, I got a bunch of videos lined up. I got a Honda Accord oil change, a Mazda 6 oil change, a set of CRV brakes. The brake job from hell is what I called it. It was horrible. I'm getting around to editing them, and I got a bike tube actually coming probably next week. So thank you for watching. Take care, everybody. Please subscribe if you want any more auto repair and that kind of thing. Alright, take it easy, everyone.